Sometimes the most powerful changes come from the most unexpected places. In the dusty hills of Montana, where silence stretches for miles and loneliness becomes a constant companion, one man's desperate need for help would lead to a transformation he never saw coming. This is the story of how a single hiring decision, made in desperation and doubt, would shatter the walls of isolation that had defined a life for decades. It's about the courage found in vulnerability, the strength discovered in tradition, and the profound way one person's authenticity can awaken something long dormant in another's soul. What happened in that small ranch kitchen over the course of 7 days would prove that sometimes the people we need most are the ones we never thought to look for. Thomas McKenzie stood in his kitchen at 5 in the morning, staring at another burned pot of coffee and a slice of bread that had somehow managed to catch fire in the toaster. At 38 years old, he had successfully managed a 1,000-acre cattle ranch for over 15 years, could deliver a breech calf in a blizzard, and had never lost a head of cattle to predators. But he couldn't make himself a decent meal to save his life. The kitchen told the story of a man at war with domesticity. Dishes piled high in the sink, their surfaces crusted with the remnants of failed cooking experiments. Empty cans of beans and soup lined the counter like soldiers in a defeated army. The refrigerator hummed with the effort of keeping alive the few sad vegetables that Thomas optimistically bought every grocery trip, only to watch them wither into brown, unrecognizable shapes. His father, Robert McKenzie, had built this ranch from nothing back in 1987. Robert had been a man of few words, but many skills, including the ability to cook hearty meals that could fuel a day of hard labor. Thomas remembered coming in from winter, feeding to find thick stews bubbling on the stove, fresh bread cooling on the counter, and the kitchen filled with warmth that had nothing to do with the wood-burning stove in the corner. But Robert had never taught his son these skills. There had always been more pressing matters on a working ranch. Cattle needed tending, fences needed mending, equipment required constant maintenance. Thomas had learned to read the sky for weather, to spot illness in livestock from across a field, to negotiate with buyers who tried to shortchange him on cattle prices. Somehow, cooking had seemed like something he could figure out later. Later had arrived with a vengeance 3 months ago when his longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, had finally retired. At 72, she had decided that the 40-minute drive from town to the ranch was becoming too much for her, especially in winter. Thomas had been devastated but understanding. Mrs. Patterson had been more than a housekeeper. She had been the keeper of the domestic order that allowed him to focus entirely on ranch operations. Since her departure, Thomas had been slowly starving. Not literally, perhaps, but the constant diet of canned soup, burned toast, and occasional trips to town for fast food was wearing him down. He was losing weight, feeling sluggish, and finding it harder to maintain the energy needed for the physical demands of ranch work. More concerning was the way the empty house echoed with silence, amplifying a loneliness that had been building for years. Thomas had always been what people politely called reserved. The truth was, he was painfully shy, especially around women. His few attempts at dating had been awkward disasters that left him convinced he was better suited to the company of cattle than people. The ranch had become both his sanctuary and his prison, a place where he could be competent and confident, but also isolated from the world beyond his property lines. The problem wasn't just the cooking. It was everything that Mrs. Patterson had quietly managed for years. Laundry that now sat in wrinkled piles. A house that felt more like a neglected barn than a home. The subtle care and attention that made a place livable rather than merely functional. Thomas was discovering that running a successful ranch meant nothing if you couldn't take care of yourself. He had tried to hire a replacement for Mrs. Patterson, but the first 2 candidates had taken one look at the isolation and decided the job wasn't for them. The third had lasted exactly 3 days before announcing that she couldn't handle being so far from civilization. Each rejection had reinforced Thomas's growing belief that he was somehow fundamentally unsuited for normal human relationships. Standing in his disaster of a kitchen that morning, Thomas made a decision that felt both desperate and necessary. He would place another ad for help, but this time he would be completely honest about what the job entailed. No more trying to make the position sound appealing with vague descriptions of light housekeeping. He would lay out the reality, a shy, somewhat hopeless rancher who needed someone to help him create a livable home environment. If that honesty drove away potential candidates, so be it. At least he wouldn't be wasting anyone's time. The drive to town took 30 minutes on good roads, longer when weather made the dirt track treacherous. Cascade Falls wasn't much of a town, population just under 3,000, but it had the essentials: a grocery store, a diner, a post office, and a weekly newspaper that ran classified ads. Thomas parked his dusty pickup truck outside the offices of the Cascade Falls Tribune and sat for a moment, gathering courage for what felt like a very public admission of failure. Inside, the newspaper office smelled of ink and coffee. Margaret Henley, who had been running the Tribune for as long as anyone could remember, looked up from her computer with the expression of someone accustomed to dealing with locals who needed help with more than just placing ads. "Morning, Thomas. What brings you to town so early?" Thomas pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket. He had written and rewritten the ad a dozen times the night before, trying to find the right balance between honesty and desperation. "Need to place a classified ad, Mrs. Henley. Looking for household help again." Margaret's expression softened with sympathy. She knew about Mrs. Patterson's retirement and had heard through the small-town grapevine about Thomas's struggles to find a replacement. "Let's see what you've got this time." Thomas unfolded the paper and read aloud, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "Household position available on working cattle ranch. 30 minutes from town. Housing provided, if desired. Seeking someone to manage cooking, basic housekeeping, and general domestic operations for single rancher. Honest work, fair pay, but genuine isolation. Employer is quiet, respectful, but admittedly hopeless at domestic tasks. Looking for someone who appreciates solitude and doesn't mind teaching basic life skills to a grown man who somehow never learned them. References required. Understanding of rural life preferred." Margaret listened without interruption, then looked up with something that might have been approval. "That's quite different from your usual approach, Thomas. Very honest. Figure if I'm going to fail, might as well fail honestly. How much will that cost me? Let's call it $15 for 2 weeks. And Thomas? I think honesty might work better than you expect." Thomas paid for the ad and drove back to the ranch, stopping at the grocery store for another load of canned goods and the eternal optimism of fresh vegetables he probably wouldn't know how to prepare properly. The day passed in the familiar rhythm of ranch work: checking cattle, repairing a section of fence damaged by the previous week's storm, servicing equipment that would be crucial for the upcoming hay season. But underneath the routine, Thomas felt a strange mixture of dread and hope. The ad would run starting tomorrow, which meant potential phone calls, interviews, and the possibility of once again opening his private world to a stranger's judgment. He had been disappointed so many times that he almost expected failure, but something about the honest approach felt different. Maybe authenticity would succeed where diplomacy had failed. That evening, Thomas sat on his front porch as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that never lost their power to amaze him. The ranch stretched out before him, 500 head of prime beef cattle scattered across pastures that his father had worked to establish and improve. By any measure, Thomas had built a successful life. The operation was profitable, the land was well managed, and his reputation among other ranchers was solid. But success felt hollow when you ate cold soup from a can while standing over the kitchen sink, too tired to even attempt cooking after a long day of physical labor. Thomas wondered if this was how his life would continue. Professional competence masking personal inadequacy, financial security unable to fill the growing emptiness of a house that felt more like a well-appointed barn than a home. 3 days later, the phone rang. Thomas was in the barn, checking on a cow that had been limping slightly, when he heard the shrill ring echoing from the house. By the time he jogged back and washed his hands, he had missed the call, but the answering machine light was blinking. He pressed play and heard a woman's voice, clear and direct. "This message is for Thomas McKenzie regarding the household position advertised in the Tribune. My name is Sarah Yazzie. I'm calling about your ad, and I appreciate the honesty in your description. I worked in household management for 12 years, mostly on ranches and remote properties. I understand isolation, and I understand men who know cattle better than kitchens. If you're still looking for help, please call me back at this number. I'm available for an interview at your convenience." Thomas played the message 3 times, struck by something in the woman's voice that was both professional and somehow warm. No hesitation, no questions about the isolation or the teaching basic life skills part of the job description. Just a straightforward response that suggested she had read his honest ad and wasn't intimidated by it. He called back that evening, after finishing his chores and summoning the courage for what he always found to be an awkward conversation. The phone rang twice before the same clear voice answered. Sarah Yazzie speaking. Ms. Yazzie, this is Thomas Mackenzie returning your call about the household position. Thank you for calling back, Mr. Mackenzie. I read your ad in the Tribune, and I'm interested in discussing the position. Could you tell me a bit more about what you're looking for? Thomas found himself relaxing slightly. Sarah's voice was matter-of-fact, businesslike but not cold. He described the ranch, the distance from town, the scope of work that needed to be done. He explained about Mrs. Patterson's long tenure and his complete failure to maintain household order in her absence. I should probably mention, Sarah said after he finished, that I'm Navajo. Some people have opinions about that. I wanted to be upfront since you were honest in your ad. Thomas paused, not because he had any issue with her heritage, but because he was struck by the parallel honesty. Just as he had decided to be truthful about his shortcomings, she was being direct about something she had apparently learned to address head-on. Ms. Yazzie, I don't care what your background is as long as you can help me figure out how to make this place livable. When would you be available for an interview? I could drive out tomorrow afternoon if that works for you. Around 2 o'clock? That would be perfect. I'll give you directions. After hanging up, Thomas realized he felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation that wasn't tinged with dread. There had been something reassuring about Sarah Yazzie's straightforward approach, a sense that she understood exactly what she was signing up for. Maybe, just maybe, his strategy of radical honesty was about to pay off. The next day, Thomas spent the morning trying to make the house presentable, though he quickly realized this was like trying to polish a barn. The kitchen was hopeless, his laundry situation was beyond salvaging in one day, and the living areas looked exactly like what they were. Spaces occupied by a man who had no idea how to create a home. At exactly 2 o'clock, a dusty blue pickup truck pulled into his driveway. Thomas watched from the kitchen window as a tall woman climbed out, took a long look at the ranch buildings, and walked toward the front door with the confident stride of someone accustomed to new places and uncertain situations. Sarah Yazzie was not what Thomas had been expecting, though he realized he hadn't really known what to expect. She was tall, probably close to 6 feet, with long black hair pulled back in practical braid. She wore jeans, boots, and a simple button-down shirt that suggested someone dressed for potential work rather than making an impression. What struck him most was her eyes, dark, intelligent, and completely unintimidated by the isolation surrounding her. Mr. Mackenzie? I am Sarah Yazzie. Her handshake was firm, direct, and brief. No lingering social awkwardness, just professional acknowledgement. Thomas invited her inside, acutely aware of the house's shortcomings, but somehow less embarrassed than he had expected to be. Sarah walked through the main living areas and kitchen without comment, her expression neutral but observant. She asked practical questions about utilities, household systems, grocery shopping arrangements. When they reached the kitchen, she stopped and surveyed the chaos with what might have been professional assessment rather than shock. How long since your last housekeeper left? 3 months. And you've been managing on your own since then? Managing is a generous term. Surviving, barely. Sarah's lips curved in what might have been the beginning of a smile. Mr. Mackenzie, can I ask you a direct question? Please. What's the longest you've gone without a decent meal? Thomas thought about it seriously. Define decent. This time Sarah did smile, and the expression transformed her entire face. Something that didn't come from a can and wasn't burned. Probably about a week. When did you last eat vegetables that weren't part of soup? I honestly can't remember. Sarah nodded, as if this confirmed her assessment. Mr. Mackenzie, I think we might be able to help each other. I need a position that provides housing and some distance from certain complications in my current living situation. You need someone who can create a functional household. The question is whether you're prepared to let someone reorganize your life pretty substantially. Thomas felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. Ms. Yazzie, I'm prepared to let someone reorganize whatever they think needs reorganizing. I'm tired of living like this. When would you need me to start? Tomorrow, if you're available. Sarah walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the ranch spreading toward the mountains. She stood there for a long moment, and Thomas found himself holding his breath, waiting for another rejection. Finally, she turned back to him. I'll take the position, Mr. Mackenzie, but I have some conditions we need to discuss. Thomas felt relief wash over him so strongly that he had to sit down. After 3 failed attempts and 3 months of slowly declining living conditions, someone was finally saying yes. Someone was willing to take on the challenge of his household chaos and geographic isolation. Whatever you need, Ms. Yazzie. I'm just grateful you're willing to try. Call me Sarah. And let's talk about what this is really going to involve. They spent the next hour working out details that would reshape Thomas's life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Sarah would start the following Monday, giving her time to arrange her affairs and giving Thomas time to prepare for changes he had wanted but never quite believed were possible. As Sarah's truck disappeared down the dirt road that evening, Thomas stood in his kitchen and tried to imagine it functioning properly. For the first time in months, the future felt like something other than an endless repetition of inadequate meals and growing isolation. Change was coming to the ranch, and for once, Thomas wasn't afraid of it. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of spring weather that reminded everyone in Montana that winter never truly surrendered without a fight. Thomas had been awake since 4:30, an hour earlier than usual, consumed by a nervous energy he hadn't felt since his first day managing the ranch alone after his father's death. He had spent the weekend in a futile attempt to improve the house's condition, but his efforts had only highlighted how far things had deteriorated. The refrigerator, when cleaned out, revealed science experiments that belonged in a laboratory rather than a kitchen. The pantry contained ingredients so old they had become archaeological artifacts. Even the dishes, when properly washed, revealed patterns and colors Thomas had forgotten existed under layers of neglect. At exactly 8 o'clock, Sarah's blue pickup truck appeared on the horizon, trailing a small dust cloud as it navigated the dirt road to the ranch. Behind her truck, Thomas could see a small trailer loaded with boxes and what appeared to be furniture. The sight of someone actually moving in, someone committed enough to bring their belongings, struck him as almost surreal after months of failed attempts to find help. Sarah parked near the house and climbed out wearing work clothes that looked both practical and somehow more purposeful than anything in Thomas's wardrobe. She surveyed the ranch buildings with the same calm assessment she had shown during her interview. But now there was something proprietary in her gaze, the look of someone mentally organizing space and planning improvements. Good morning, Mr. McKenzie. I hope you're ready for some substantial changes around here. Good morning, Sarah. And yes, I think I'm ready for whatever you have in mind. The formality felt strange after their straightforward conversation during the interview, but Thomas wasn't sure how to navigate the transition from desperate employer to whatever he was about to become. Sarah seemed to understand his uncertainty and took charge with the kind of natural authority that suggested she had managed similar transitions before. Let's start by getting my things settled, then we'll talk about priorities. I brought some of my own kitchen equipment and household items. I've learned that it's easier to work with tools you trust than to adapt to someone else's system. Thomas helped unload boxes labeled in Sarah's neat handwriting. Kitchen, pots/pans, spices and seasonings, cleaning supplies, personal items. Each box represented a level of preparation and commitment that impressed him. This wasn't someone taking a temporary job. This was someone moving in to create a functional household. Sarah had requested the small guest room at the back of the house, which connected to the kitchen through what had once been a pantry. The room had its own outside entrance and a small bathroom, making it almost a separate apartment. Thomas had worried that the accommodation might seem inadequate, but Sarah appeared satisfied with the privacy and independence it offered. This will work perfectly, she said, setting down a box labeled bedroom items. I prefer having my own space, and this setup means I won't disturb your routines when I'm working early or late. With her personal items sorted, Sarah suggested they walk through the house together so she could assess what needed immediate attention versus what could be improved over time. Thomas found himself seeing his home through her eyes, and the perspective was both humbling and oddly liberating. He had been living with the shame of his domestic failures for so long that having someone evaluate the situation professionally rather than personally felt like a weight lifting. In the kitchen, Sarah opened cabinets and drawers with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting an inventory. She made notes on a small pad, occasionally asking questions about appliances, storage preferences, or dietary restrictions. Her approach was businesslike, but not judgmental, treating the chaos as a logistical challenge rather than a character flaw. When did you last cook an actual meal in this kitchen? She asked, examining the neglected stove. I'm not sure I ever have. Mrs. Patterson did all the cooking, and since she left, I've mostly been heating things up or making sandwiches. Sarah nodded, as if this confirmed her assumptions. Do you have any food allergies or strong dislikes I should know about? Not that I'm aware of. I've been eating so little variety that I'm not sure what I like anymore. Good. That means we can start fresh and figure out what works for your lifestyle and schedule. They continued through the house, Sarah taking notes on everything from laundry facilities to cleaning supply storage. In the living room, she paused at the large windows that faced west toward the mountains. These are beautiful views. Do you spend much time in here? Thomas realized he hadn't really used the living room in months, maybe longer. Not much. I mostly just collapse in the kitchen after work. That's going to change. Part of creating a functional household is making sure you have spaces where you actually want to spend time. There was something in her tone that suggested she understood more about isolation and its effects than Thomas had expected. But she didn't elaborate, and he didn't feel comfortable asking personal questions yet. By mid-morning, Sarah had completed her assessment and was ready to discuss her plan of attack. They sat at the kitchen table, Thomas with a cup of coffee that Sarah had somehow made taste better than anything he had managed in months, while she outlined her priorities. First, we need to establish basic functionality. That means getting the kitchen properly organized and stocked, setting up efficient cleaning routines, and making sure you have clean clothes and decent meals. This is about creating systems that will work even when I'm not here. Are you planning to be away often? Thomas asked, realizing he had become dependent on the idea of consistent help. Not often, but I believe in creating independence, not dependence. You should be able to maintain basic standards even when you're on your own. This struck Thomas as both practical and slightly daunting. He had been hoping for someone to take over the domestic responsibilities entirely, not someone who would expect him to learn and participate. Second, Sarah continued, we need to make this place feel like a home instead of a bunkhouse. That means attention to details beyond just cleanliness and functionality. Comfort, atmosphere, spaces that invite relaxation instead of just efficiency. Thomas looked around the kitchen, trying to imagine what she meant. The room was purely functional, designed for the business of food preparation without any consideration for comfort or aesthetics. Third, we need to address your relationship with food. You're undernourished, and that affects everything from your energy levels to your mood to your ability to handle stress. This was more personal than Thomas had expected, but Sarah's matter-of-fact tone made it easier to accept. I never learned to cook. My father wasn't much of a teacher in that area, and Mrs. Patterson always handled meals. Learning to cook isn't just about following recipes. It's about understanding nutrition, planning ahead, and creating routines that support your health and energy levels. We'll start simple and build from there. Sarah's fourth priority surprised him. We need to address the social isolation. This ranch is remote, but that doesn't mean you have to live like a hermit. Part of my job is helping you create connections with the community and maintaining relationships that support your well-being. Thomas felt his automatic defensiveness rising. I'm not much of a social person, Sarah. I've tried, and it doesn't usually work out well. Sarah studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful rather than critical. Mr. Mackenzie, can I tell you something I've learned from working with people in remote areas? Sure. Isolation is different from solitude. Solitude is chosen and refreshing. Isolation is imposed and damaging. You've been living in isolation, not solitude, and it's affecting more than just your domestic situation. This observation hit closer to home than Thomas was comfortable with, but he couldn't deny its accuracy. The loneliness had become a constant background presence in his life, like a low-grade fever that sapped his energy without quite demanding attention. I'm not suggesting you become a social butterfly, Sarah continued, but human connection is a basic need like good food and adequate shelter. Part of creating a functional household is creating a base from which you can engage with the world instead of hiding from it. Thomas wasn't sure how to respond to this level of insight from someone he had hired to help with cooking and cleaning, but something in Sarah's tone suggested personal experience with the distinction between isolation and solitude. The rest of the morning passed in a flurry of activity that transformed the atmosphere of the house. Sarah emptied the refrigerator completely, discarding expired items and making lists of replacements needed. She reorganized the pantry with an efficiency that seemed almost magical, creating order from chaos and somehow making the available space seem twice as large. By lunchtime, She had prepared what she called a simple meal, but which seemed like a feast to Thomas. Grilled chicken with vegetables he couldn't identify, but which tasted better than anything he remembered eating. They ate in the kitchen, but Sarah had somehow made even that space feel more welcoming with small changes in lighting and the addition of a tablecloth from her own supplies. "This is incredible," Thomas said, genuinely amazed by the transformation already visible after just a few hours. "This is just the beginning," Sarah replied. "Real change takes time, but establishing basic functionality can happen quickly if you're systematic about it." That afternoon, Thomas returned to his usual ranch work while Sarah continued her domestic revolution. When he came back to the house at evening feeding time, the changes were dramatic enough to make him wonder if he had walked into the wrong building. The kitchen was spotless and organized, but more than that, it felt alive and purposeful in a way it never had during his tenure. Sarah had prepared what she called a proper dinner: beef stew with vegetables and fresh bread that filled the house with smells Thomas had forgotten were possible. They ate together at a table she had set with dishes and utensils that made the meal feel special rather than merely functional. "I should mention," Sarah said as they finished eating, "that I prefer to take my meals with the family rather than separately. I hope that's acceptable to you." Thomas realized he hadn't thought about this arrangement, but the prospect of shared meals was actually appealing rather than intrusive. "That sounds good to me. I haven't had conversation with dinner in quite a while." "Good. Shared meals are important for more than just nutrition. They're one of the basic ways humans create community and connection." As if to illustrate her point, their dinner conversation had been easier and more natural than Thomas expected. Sarah asked thoughtful questions about the ranch operation, demonstrated genuine interest in the challenges and rewards of cattle ranching, and shared enough about her own background to make the exchange feel balanced rather than one-sided. She had grown up in the Navajo Nation in Arizona, the daughter of a woman who had worked as a housekeeper and cooked for ranching families throughout the Southwest. Sarah had learned domestic skill from necessity, helping her mother maintain households while developing an understanding of both the isolation and the independence that defined rural life. "I've always been comfortable with space and silence," she said. "Some people find remote areas lonely, but I find them peaceful. There's something about being able to see the horizon in all directions that feels like freedom rather than limitation." Thomas understood exactly what she meant, though he had never heard it expressed so clearly. The ranch had always represented freedom to him as well, but lately that freedom had felt more like abandonment. After dinner, Sarah insisted that Thomas help with the cleanup, explaining that learning to maintain order was as important as creating it initially. She guided him through proper dishwashing technique, efficient kitchen organization, and the small routines that kept a household running smoothly. "The goal is to make these tasks automatic rather than overwhelming," she explained. "Most people avoid domestic work because they don't have systems. Once you develop routines, everything becomes easier." Thomas found the process oddly satisfying. There was something meditative about the warm, soapy water, the systematic approach to returning items to their proper places, the visible transformation from disorder to cleanliness. It reminded him of the satisfaction he felt when ranch tasks were completed properly and efficiently. As they finished cleaning up, Sarah outlined the next day's priorities. She wanted to tackle the laundry situation, continue organizing the household systems, and begin teaching Thomas some basic cooking skills. "We'll start with simple things that fit your schedule and lifestyle," she said. "Breakfast items, basic lunches, simple dinner preparations that don't require constant attention." Standing in his transformed kitchen, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in months: genuine optimism about the immediate future. The house already felt more like a home than it had since Mrs. Patterson's departure. More importantly, he felt like he was beginning to understand the difference between having someone take care of him and learning to take care of himself with guidance and support. "Sarah," he said as they finished wiping down the counters, "I can't tell you how grateful I am that you're here. This already feels completely different." Sarah paused in her work and looked at him seriously. "Mr. McKenzie, we've made a good start, but real change takes time and commitment. Are you prepared for the work involved in learning to live differently?" The question was more challenging than Thomas expected, but he found himself answering with more confidence than he had felt in years. "Yes, I think I am. I'm tired of living the way I've been living." Sarah nodded with what might have been approval. "Good, because tomorrow we're going to start building the life you actually want to live rather than just surviving the one you ended up with." As Thomas settled into his bedroom that night, He could hear the quiet sounds of Sarah organizing her own space in the guest room. For the first time in months, the house felt occupied by life rather than just existence. The silence was no longer empty, but peaceful, filled with the potential of positive change rather than the weight of accumulated failure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new lessons, but for the first time since Mrs. Patterson's departure, Thomas felt equipped to meet them. The transformation had begun, and he was finally ready to be an active participant in his own life rather than just a passive observer of his own decline. The last thing he heard before falling asleep was the faint sound of Sarah's radio playing softly in her room, traditional Navajo music that seemed to blend perfectly with the vast Montana silence outside his windows. Change had come to the ranch, and it sounded like coming home. Tuesday morning brought with it a revelation that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. Thomas Mackenzie woke up looking forward to breakfast. The smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen wasn't the familiar aroma of burned grounds and frustrated attempts, but something rich and inviting that actually made him eager to start the day. Sarah was already in the kitchen when Thomas appeared, dressed for ranch work, but moving with the efficient grace of someone who had transformed food preparation into a form of art. She looked up from the stove where something that smelled like heaven was sending steam into the cool morning air. "Good morning, Mr. Mackenzie. I hope you're ready for your first cooking lesson." Thomas paused in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. "Right now, I need to get out to check the cattle, and the forecast shows possible storms later." Sarah turned from the stove with a spatula in hand and a patient expression that suggested she had anticipated this exact response. "How long do you usually take for breakfast?" "I don't really eat breakfast. Maybe coffee and a piece of toast if I remember." "And how do you feel by mid-morning?" Thomas considered this. "Usually pretty tired, actually. Sluggish." "Right. So we're going to fix that problem while you learn something useful. Come over here." What followed was Thomas's first lesson in what Sarah called fuel food. Simple, nutritious meals designed to sustain energy through physical work rather than just fill empty space. She guided him through the process of making what she termed a rancher's breakfast. Eggs scrambled with vegetables and cheese, served with toast made from bread she had somehow found time to bake the previous evening. The key is understanding that food is fuel for your body the same way gasoline is fuel for your truck, Sarah explained as she demonstrated proper egg scrambling technique. You wouldn't put water in your gas tank and expect your truck to run well. Why would you expect your body to function properly on coffee and processed food? Thomas found himself paying attention in a way he had never applied to domestic tasks before. Sarah's explanations made sense from a practical, operational perspective that resonated with his ranching mindset. She wasn't teaching him cooking as an abstract skill, but as a necessary component of efficient ranch management. "Now you try," Sarah said, handing him the spatula. Thomas's first attempt at scrambling eggs resulted in what could charitably be described as rustic, but Sarah's guidance was patient and constructive rather than critical. She showed him how to adjust the heat, how to move the eggs in the pan, how to recognize when they were properly cooked rather than rubbery. Cooking is like working with animals, she observed as Thomas gradually improved his technique. You have to pay attention, be patient, and respond to what you're seeing rather than what you think should be happening. The analogy was perfect. Thomas understood the process of reading subtle signs and adjusting his approach accordingly. When Sarah framed cooking in terms he could relate to, the skills seemed achievable rather than mysterious. They ate breakfast together as the sun rose over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that made the familiar landscape look somehow new and promising. Thomas couldn't remember the last time he had started a day feeling properly fed and energetic rather than already behind and struggling. "This is going to sound strange," he said as they finished eating, "but I feel different. More alert, I guess." "That's what proper nutrition does," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. "Your body has been running on empty for months. Give it actual fuel, and it responds accordingly." Thomas headed out to his morning ranch chores with a sense of purpose and energy that surprised him. The cattle were in good condition, the fences were holding well, and the equipment was functioning properly, but somehow everything seemed more manageable when he wasn't operating from a baseline of constant fatigue and inadequate nutrition. When he returned to the house at midday, Sarah had transformed another area of his domestic life. The laundry room, which had become a disaster zone of clean and dirty clothes mixed together in archaeological layers, was now organized and functional. More importantly, Sarah was waiting with a simple lunch and another lesson. This afternoon, we're going to work on meal planning, she announced. Not just what you're going to eat, but how to think ahead so you're not constantly scrambling for options. She spread a notebook on the kitchen table alongside what appeared to be a carefully organized collection of recipes, shopping lists, and scheduling charts. Thomas realized that Sarah approached household management with the same systematic thinking he applied to ranch operations. Tell me about your typical week, Sarah said. What are your busiest days? When you need quick meals versus when you have more time? What seasons require different approaches? Thomas found himself describing his work patterns in detail, discussing the seasonal rhythms of cattle ranching, the unpredictable demands of weather and equipment failures, the times when he worked from dawn to well past dark, and needed food that could be prepared quickly or eaten on the go. Sarah listened and took notes with the attention of someone developing a comprehensive strategy. So spring is your busiest time with calving, summer requires early starts to beat the heat, fall is harvest and preparation time, and winter allows for more flexible schedules but requires foods that provide extra energy for cold weather work. That's exactly right. I never thought about how that should affect meal planning. Most people don't. They try to eat the same way year-round and wonder why it doesn't work. Your food should support your lifestyle, not complicate it. Sarah's approach to meal planning was revelation to Thomas. Instead of random grocery shopping and hopeful improvisation, she showed him how to think systematically about nutrition, preparation time, seasonal availability, and storage requirements. More importantly, she demonstrated how proper planning actually saved time and energy rather than requiring additional effort. The goal is to eliminate the daily question of what am I going to eat, she explained. When you know what you're having for dinner before you start morning chores, you can prep ingredients ahead of time, take items out of the freezer, and avoid the fatigue-driven decisions that usually lead to poor choices. They spent the afternoon developing what Sarah called a seasonal meal rotation, a flexible framework that would provide variety while ensuring Thomas always had nutritious options that fit his schedule and skill level. The system was sophisticated enough to prevent boredom, but simple enough for someone with limited cooking experience to manage successfully. The key is having 3 categories of meals, Sarah explained as they organized the system. Quick and simple for busy days, standard meals for normal schedules, and more elaborate options for times when you have extra energy and want to try something new. Thomas was impressed by the logic of the approach, but also slightly overwhelmed by the level of organization involved. This seems like a lot to keep track of. It's front-loaded effort, Sarah said. You put in time and thought now to eliminate daily stress and decision-making later. It's the same principle as preparing for calving season or organizing equipment before harvest. The comparison made perfect sense to Thomas. He was accustomed to advanced planning and systematic preparation in ranch management. Sarah was simply applying the same principles to household management, creating efficiencies that would pay dividends over time. That evening brought Thomas's first real cooking lesson. Sarah had planned what she called a teaching meal, something with enough steps to demonstrate important techniques, but simple enough for a beginner to manage successfully. They were making a beef and vegetable stew, using meat from Thomas's own cattle and vegetables from the surprisingly well-stocked grocery store in Cascade Falls. Cooking meat properly is one of the most important skills for someone in your situation, Sarah explained as she demonstrated how to brown beef for the stew. You have access to excellent protein, but you need to know how to prepare it in ways that enhance rather than destroy its nutritional value. Thomas watched carefully as Sarah showed him how to cut meat to proper sizes, how to season it effectively, how to achieve the proper browning that would develop flavor throughout the cooking process. Her explanations were clear and practical, focusing on the why behind each step rather than just the how. Now you try, she said, handing him a knife. Thomas's knife work was clumsy at first, but Sarah's guidance was patient and encouraging. She showed him how to hold the knife properly, how to use his other hand to guide the cuts, how to maintain consistent sizes that would cook evenly. The work was meditative in a way Thomas hadn't expected, requiring focus and attention that crowded out other concerns. As they worked together preparing the stew, Thomas found himself relaxing in a way that seemed impossible during his usual evening routine of microwave food and solitary eating. The kitchen felt alive with purposeful activity, filled with good smells and the comfortable rhythm of shared work. Tell me about growing up on the Navajo Nation, Thomas said as they waited for the stew to simmer. Was it very different from this kind of ranching? Sarah was quiet for a moment, stirring the pot thoughtfully. In some ways very different, in others remarkably similar. Different landscape, different animals, but the same relationship with land and weather and the cycles of caring for living things. She described growing up in a world where traditional knowledge and modern necessities intersected in complex ways, where her grandmother's teachings about plants and seasons existed alongside the practical demands of contemporary life. Her mother's work as a housekeeper had taken the family to ranches throughout the Southwest, giving Sarah exposure to different approaches to rural living while maintaining strong connections to her cultural roots. I learned to cook from watching my grandmother and my mother, but also from necessity, Sarah said. When you're responsible for feeding family members who work physically demanding jobs, you learn quickly that food isn't just about taste. It's about sustaining people through difficult work. Thomas found himself sharing more about his own background than he had with anyone in years. He described his father's approach to ranching, the pressures of maintaining a family operation as a single person, the isolation that had gradually become more burden than choice. Sarah listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated genuine interest rather than polite conversation. "It sounds like you've been carrying a lot of responsibility alone for a long time," she observed. "I suppose I have. I never really thought about it that way. Sometimes what people call independence is really just another form of being stuck. True independence means having choices, including the choice to accept help when it would improve your life." This observation hit Thomas with surprising force. He had always thought of his solitary approach to ranch management as strength and self-reliance, but Sarah's perspective suggested it might actually be a limitation rather than an asset. The stew was ready by full darkness, and they sat down to what Thomas realized was the best meal he had eaten in years. The beef was tender and flavorful, the vegetables retained their texture and individuality, and the overall combination was both satisfying and energizing rather than just filling. "I can't believe I helped make this," Thomas said, genuinely amazed by the results of their collaboration. "You did make it," Sarah corrected. "I just provided guidance. The work was yours." After dinner, Sarah insisted they clean up together, reinforcing the lessons about maintaining order and developing efficient routines. But the process felt natural rather than forced, an extension of the collaborative cooking rather than a separate chore. "Tomorrow we'll work on breakfast preparation that you can manage on your own," Sarah said as they finished cleaning. "The goal is for you to be able to maintain good nutrition even when I'm not here to help." That night, Thomas lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch: wind in the cottonwoods, cattle settling for the night, the distant call of coyotes in the hills. But underneath these familiar sounds was something new, the quiet presence of another person who understood the rhythms of rural life and was committed to helping him live better within those rhythms. For the first time in years, Thomas felt like his life was expanding rather than contracting. The day had been full of new learning and genuine accomplishment, but also connection and shared purpose that reminded him why he had chosen this life in the first place. The isolation was beginning to transform back into the solitude he had originally sought, and the difference was profound. Sarah's presence in the house was already changing more than just his domestic situation. It was changing his relationship with his own life, helping him remember that sustainable independence required skills and support systems rather than just stubborn self-reliance. Tomorrow would bring new lessons and continued growth, and for the first time in months, Thomas was eager rather than apprehensive about what lay ahead. The transformation was accelerating, and Thomas was beginning to understand that learning to take care of himself properly might be the key to taking care of everything else in his life more effectively as well. Wednesday morning arrived with a spring snowstorm that transformed the ranch into a crystalline wonderland, while creating practical challenges that would test everything Thomas had learned about managing both cattle and his newly organized household. Sarah was in the kitchen before dawn, moving with quiet efficiency as she prepared for what she somehow knew would be a demanding day. "Storm days require different planning," she said when Thomas appeared, already dressed for cold weather work. "You'll be out longer than usual, burning more calories, and coming back exhausted. Your food needs to support that reality." She handed him a travel mug of coffee that was somehow richer and more satisfying than anything he had managed to produce on his own, along with what she called a working breakfast a substantial meal packaged in a way that he could eat quickly if necessary, or take with him if the cattle situation required immediate attention. "This is incredible," Thomas said, examining the carefully wrapped combination of hearty breakfast sandwich and energy-packed sides. "How did you know we need this?" "I grew up watching weather patterns affect work patterns. Today will be about taking care of the cattle first, but you need to take care of yourself as well, or you'll be useless to them and everyone else." Thomas headed into the storm with a sense of preparedness he hadn't felt during previous weather emergencies. The cattle were clustering in the lee of the ridge where the snow accumulation was lighter and the wind less severe. Most were handling the conditions well, but several younger animals needed to be moved to more sheltered areas, and the water sources required attention to prevent freezing. The work was demanding and took longer than usual, but Thomas found himself maintaining energy and focus throughout the morning in a way that seemed directly connected to starting the day with proper nutrition. When he finally returned to the house at midday, soaked and chilled but successful in securing the herd's welfare, Sarah had somehow anticipated both his physical condition and his need for rapid recovery. Hot soup was waiting, along with dry clothes warmed by the heating vent, and a systematic plan for getting him fed, warm, and ready for the afternoon task that the storm would inevitably require. But more than just practical preparation, Sarah's response to the emergency revealed something about her character that impressed Thomas in ways he hadn't expected. "You were watching the cattle situation, weren't you?" he asked as they ate lunch together. "You knew how long I'd be out there and what condition I'd be in when I got back." Sarah paused in her eating, considering her response. "I've been watching everything since I arrived. Weather, routines, the way you handle problems. Understanding the patterns is part of doing this job properly. But this goes beyond just household management, doesn't it? You understand ranch operations." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then seemed to come to some kind of decision. "My grandfather was a rancher on the reservation. Different scale than this, different challenges, but the same basic work of caring for livestock in difficult conditions. I grew up helping with cattle, horses, sheep. I know what the work requires." This revelation reframed everything Thomas thought he understood about Sarah's qualifications for her position. She wasn't just someone who had learned domestic skills out of necessity. She was someone who understood the integrated relationship between household management and ranch operations from personal experience. "Why didn't you mention this when you interviewed?" "People have assumptions about Navajo women and what we're capable of. Sometimes it's easier to let them discover your qualifications gradually rather than challenging their preconceptions up front." Thomas felt a flush of embarrassment as he realized his own assumptions had been challenged and corrected without his even being aware of it. He had hired Sarah to help with cooking and cleaning, not recognizing that she brought a depth of understanding about rural life that went far beyond basic domestic skills. "I think I may have underestimated what you're capable of," he said honestly. "Most people do. The question is what you do with that information once you have it." The afternoon brought more storm-related challenges that transformed their working relationship in unexpected ways. A section of fence had been damaged by wind and falling branches, creating a potential escape route for cattle that could become dangerous if not addressed quickly. Thomas was preparing to tackle the repair alone when Sarah appeared dressed for outdoor work and carrying tools. "You'll need help with this," she said matter-of-factly. "Fence work in these conditions isn't a one-person job." Thomas's first instinct was to protest that fence repair wasn't part of her job description, but something in Sarah's expression suggested this would be both futile and somehow insulting. Instead, he found himself accepting her help with a gratitude that surprised him. Working together in the wind and snow, Thomas discovered that Sarah's understanding of fence construction and repair was both practical and intuitive. She anticipated what tools would be needed, understood how to position materials for maximum efficiency, and worked with the kind of steady competence that made difficult tasks manageable rather than overwhelming. "Where did you learn fence work?" Thomas asked as they stretched wire through the snow. "Grandfather's ranch. Also helped my mother's employers with various projects over the years. Ranchers often need extra hands, and I was usually available during school breaks." The work progressed smoothly despite the challenging conditions, but more than just completing a necessary task, the collaboration revealed aspects of both their characters that hadn't been visible in their previous interactions. Sarah's competence with physical work was impressive, but Thomas was equally struck by her approach to problem-solving and teamwork. She didn't try to take over or prove her expertise, but contributed her skills in support of shared goals. When Thomas's approach to a particular challenge wasn't working, Sarah would quietly suggest alternatives without making him feel criticized or inadequate. When her knowledge was clearly superior, she shared information in ways that educated rather than diminished. "You're a natural teacher," Thomas observed as they secured the last section of fence. "I had good teachers myself. My grandmother always said that knowledge kept to yourself is wasted, but knowledge shared thoughtlessly can be harmful. The goal is to help people learn, not to show how much you know." By the time they returned to the house, Thomas felt like he had gained not just a competent household manager, but a genuine partner in maintaining the ranch. The realization was both exhilarating and slightly intimidating. He had grown accustomed to making all decisions and carrying all responsibilities alone. Having someone with both the capability and the willingness to share the load represented a fundamental shift in how his life could function. That evening, Sarah suggested they tackle a project she had been considering since her arrival, reorganizing the living room into a space that actually invited use rather than just existing as a neglected formal area. Thomas had been avoiding the room for months, using it primarily as storage for items that didn't belong anywhere else. "A house should have spaces that feed your spirit, not just your body," Sarah explained as they surveyed the cluttered room. "You work hard physically every day. You need places where you can relax properly, not just collapse from exhaustion." Together, they cleared away the accumulated debris of Thomas's domestic avoidance and began to reveal the room's potential. Sarah had a gift for seeing how spaces could function better with simple changes in arrangement and organization. She moved furniture to take advantage of the western light, created conversation areas that felt intimate rather than formal, and somehow made the large room feel welcoming rather than overwhelming. "I haven't really used this room since my father died," Thomas admitted as they worked. "It was his favorite space, and after he was gone, I just couldn't figure out how to be comfortable in here." Sarah paused in her arranging of books and looked at him thoughtfully. "Sometimes avoiding spaces keeps us stuck in grief instead of moving through it. What if we created a way for this room to honor your father's memory while also serving your current needs?" What followed was one of the most emotionally significant conversations Thomas had experienced since his father's death 5 years earlier. Sarah listened as he described Robert McKenzie's evening routine of sitting by the western windows with his coffee, reviewing the day's work, and planning tomorrow's priorities. She understood both Thomas's reluctance to intrude on that memory and his need to reclaim the space for his own use. "What if we arrange things so you could sit where he sat when you want to feel connected to him, but also created new areas that are completely your own?" Sarah suggested. "Memory doesn't require avoiding life. It requires integrating the past with the present in ways that honor both." They spent the evening creating what Sarah called memory spaces and living spaces within the same room. His father's chair remained in its favorite position, but they added comfortable seating in other areas where Thomas could read, listen to music, or simply enjoy the view without feeling like he was competing with his father's ghost. "This is remarkable," Thomas said as they finished arranging the transformed space. "It feels like the same room, but also completely different." "That's because it is the same room," Sarah replied. "We just revealed its potential instead of letting it be defined by avoidance." As they settled into the newly arranged space with after-dinner coffee, Thomas realized that the evening's work had accomplished far more than just room organization. Sarah had somehow guided him through a process of emotional healing that he hadn't even recognized he needed. "Can I ask you something personal?" Thomas said, emboldened by the evening's emotional honesty. "Of course. What brought you to this job? I mean, you're clearly overqualified for household work. You could probably manage a ranch yourself if you wanted to." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the snow-covered landscape visible through the western windows. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested the question touched on significant personal history. "I was managing a household and helping with ranch operations for a family outside Flagstaff. Good people, fair employers, work I enjoyed. But their oldest son developed what he considered romantic interests in me. When I made it clear those feelings weren't reciprocated, the situation became uncomfortable. The family sided with their son, suggesting I had somehow encouraged his attention." Thomas felt a flash of anger on her behalf. "That's completely unfair. It's not uncommon. Native women working for non-native families often face assumptions about availability and propriety that have nothing to do with our professional capabilities or personal boundaries. Sarah continued, describing how the situation had escalated until it became impossible to maintain professional relationships within the household. She had left the position with good references, but without the sense of security that comes from knowing your competence and professionalism will be respected regardless of other people's inappropriate behavior. I needed a position where I could demonstrate my capabilities without navigating unwanted personal complications. Your ad suggested someone who was focused on practical needs rather than social dynamics. That appealed to me. Thomas felt a profound sense of responsibility settling over him. Sarah had taken a chance on his household, not just as a professional opportunity, but as a refuge from a situation where her expertise had been overshadowed by someone else's inappropriate behavior. I hope I can provide the kind of working environment you're looking for, he said seriously. Professional respect and personal boundaries are important to me as well. I believe you can, Sarah replied. But I wanted you to understand why this position matters to me beyond just employment. I need to rebuild confidence in my ability to work in situations where my professionalism is valued over other considerations. The conversation left Thomas with a deeper understanding of Sarah's character and a stronger appreciation for the courage she had shown in taking on his household. She wasn't just helping him organize his domestic life. She was rebuilding her own professional confidence after an experience that had challenged her faith in people's ability to maintain appropriate boundaries and respect. That night, as Thomas settled into his bedroom, he reflected on the extraordinary changes that had occurred in just 3 days. His house was becoming a home. His relationship with food was transforming his energy and outlook, and his understanding of what was possible in his daily life had expanded dramatically. But more than these practical improvements, Sarah's presence was changing his perspective on collaboration, learning, and the balance between independence and interdependence. She was teaching him that accepting help wasn't a sign of weakness, but a path to greater capability and satisfaction. The storm had revealed not just Sarah's additional skills, but the potential for their working relationship to evolve into something far more valuable than Thomas had originally envisioned. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities for learning and growth, and Thomas was beginning to understand that the transformation of his life was just beginning to reveal its full scope and significance. Thursday morning brought clear skies and the kind of crystalline air that followed mountain storms, making every detail of the landscape stand out with exceptional clarity. Thomas woke before dawn as usual, but instead of the groggy reluctance that had characterized his mornings for months, he felt alert and energetic, eager to assess how the cattle had weathered the storm and to continue the domestic transformation that was reshaping his entire life. Sarah was already in the kitchen, but this morning she had prepared what she called a graduation breakfast, a meal that Thomas would prepare himself under her guidance, demonstrating the skills he had learned over the past few days. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. This was a test of whether he could maintain the nutritional foundation she had established even when working independently. Today you're going to cook for both of us, Sarah announced, handing him an apron that she had somehow acquired and embroidered with a simple ranch logo. I'll provide guidance if you need it, but the goal is for you to demonstrate that you can create a proper meal using the techniques we've practiced. Thomas felt a flutter of performance anxiety, but also genuine excitement about the challenge. 3 days earlier, he would have considered such a task impossible. Now, with Sarah's systematic instruction behind him, it felt achievable and even enjoyable. Under Sarah's watchful but patient supervision, Thomas prepared scrambled eggs with vegetables, bacon cooked to proper crispness without burning, and toast made from Sarah's homemade bread. The process required concentration and attention to timing, but it also provided the kind of meditative focus that Thomas was beginning to associate with domestic work done properly. "This is really good," Sarah said as they ate together, and Thomas could hear genuine approval in her voice rather than polite encouragement. "You've internalized the basic principles faster than I expected. It helps that you teach them in ways that make sense to me," Thomas replied. "When you explain cooking in terms of managing processes and paying attention to feedback, it connects to skills I already have." "That's exactly right. The skills you use to manage cattle and equipment can be applied to managing food preparation and household systems. It's all about observation, timing, and appropriate response to changing conditions." After breakfast, Thomas headed out to check on the cattle's post-storm condition while Sarah tackled what she called the final organizational challenge, his office and paperwork systems. Thomas had been dreading this confrontation with months of accumulated administrative chaos, but Sarah's track record with domestic disasters had given him confidence that even his paperwork situation could be salvaged. The cattle had weathered the storm well, with only minor issues that required attention. More importantly, Thomas found himself working with a level of energy and focus that seemed directly related to starting the day with proper nutrition and a sense of domestic order. The connection between personal care and professional effectiveness was becoming impossible to ignore. When he returned to the house at midday, Thomas discovered that Sarah had performed another minor miracle. His office, which had been a monument to procrastination and avoidance, was now organized and functional. But more than just creating order from chaos, Sarah had established systems that would prevent the paperwork situation from deteriorating again. The goal isn't just to clean up the current mess, she explained as she showed him the new filing system she had created. It's to establish routines that prevent future accumulation of chaos. 15 minutes a day of consistent attention will keep this system functional indefinitely. Sarah had organized everything from tax records to equipment warranties to cattle documentation into logical categories with clear labeling and efficient storage. More importantly, she had created what she called action systems, designated places for items that required immediate attention versus those that needed to be filed versus those that could be discarded. This is incredible, Thomas said, examining the transformation. But it also looks complicated to maintain. It looks complicated because it's new, Sarah replied. Once you understand the logic behind the organization, maintaining it becomes automatic. The key is dealing with papers when you first encounter them, rather than setting them aside for later attention. They spent the afternoon working through the practical aspects of the new system, with Sarah demonstrating how to process different types of documents and how to maintain the organization through daily habits. Thomas was impressed by how much easier it became to locate information and manage ongoing responsibilities when everything had a designated place and clear handling procedures. You know, Thomas said as they finished updating his equipment maintenance records, I'm starting to see patterns in everything you've taught me. It's all about creating systems that make daily life easier rather than harder. Exactly. Most people create chaos by avoiding organization, then feel overwhelmed by the chaos they've created. The solution is to invest time up front in creating systems that reduce stress and effort over time. That evening brought what Sarah announced would be their final formal cooking lesson. She wanted to teach Thomas to prepare what she called a confidence meal, something impressive enough to serve to guests, but simple enough for him to manage successfully on special occasions. Wait, Thomas said, pausing in his preparation of ingredients. Guests? I don't really have guests. Sarah looked at him with an expression that suggested she had been waiting for this exact comment. Mr. Mackenzie, when was the last time you invited anyone to visit your home? Thomas thought about it seriously and realized the answer was both embarrassing and telling. I honestly can't remember. Probably not since my father's funeral. And why is that? I suppose because the house wasn't suitable for having people over. Also because I'm not really comfortable with social situations. Sarah nodded, as if this confirmed her analysis. So the condition of your house became an excuse for avoiding social connections, which reinforced your isolation, which made social connections seem more difficult, which justified avoiding them further. The accuracy of this assessment was uncomfortable but undeniable. Thomas had been using his domestic inadequacy as a shield against social anxiety, not recognizing that the shield had become a prison. Part of creating a functional household, Sarah continued, is creating a home that can accommodate relationships and community connections. You don't have to become a social butterfly, but you should have the option of inviting people into your space without embarrassment. The meal Sarah taught him was perfect for Thomas's situation. Beef roast with vegetables that could cook unattended while he worked, accompanied by simple sides that showcased the quality of local ingredients. The preparation required planning and basic techniques, but nothing so complex that it would intimidate him into avoiding the attempt. As they cooked together, Sarah shared more about her own experience with the relationship between domestic skills and social confidence. Growing up, she had watched her mother use cooking and hospitality as ways of creating connections across cultural divides, building bridges between Navajo traditions and the diverse communities where they worked. Food is one of the most basic ways humans connect with each other, Sarah explained as she demonstrated proper roast preparation. When you can feed people well, you're offering them something fundamentally valuable. It changes the dynamic of relationships in positive ways. Thomas found himself thinking about the few social relationships he had maintained over the years, mostly with neighboring ranchers and business associates. How many of those connections have been limited by his inability to offer proper hospitality? How many potential friendships have been constrained by his domestic inadequacy? I think I've been more isolated than I realized, he admitted as they waited for the roast to reach proper temperature. Isolation often builds on itself, Sarah agreed. But the good news is that connection can build on itself too. Once you have the confidence and capability to reach out, you might be surprised by how many people are interested in deeper friendships. The meal they prepared together was exceptional, tender, flavorful, and presented with a level of care that made even a simple dinner feel special. More importantly, Thomas felt genuine pride in his contribution to creating something that could be shared with others without embarrassment. This is restaurant quality, he said, amazed by what they had accomplished together. This is home cooking done properly, Sarah corrected. Restaurant food tries to impress. Home cooking tries to nourish and welcome. There's an important difference. As they cleaned up from dinner, Sarah made an announcement that Thomas had been both expecting and dreading. Mr. Mackenzie, I think it's time for me to step back from daily meal preparation and let you manage your own nutrition using the skills and systems we've established. Thomas felt a moment of panic. Already? It's only been 4 days. 4 days of intensive instruction and practice. You've demonstrated that you can prepare nutritious meals, maintain kitchen organization, and manage the planning that makes everything else possible. Continuing to do things for you at this point would create dependence rather than competence. Sarah was right, and Thomas knew it, but the prospect of managing alone felt daunting after experiencing how much easier life became with proper domestic support. I'm not abandoning you, Sarah continued, apparently recognizing his anxiety. I'm transitioning from doing things for you to being available for consultation and assistance when needed. You'll still have support, but you'll also have independence. They spent the remainder of the evening reviewing the systems Sarah had established, going through meal plans and organizational structures that would support Thomas's continued progress. Sarah's approach to this transition was as thoughtful and systematic as her approach to everything else, designed to build confidence rather than create abandonment anxiety. The most important thing to remember, Sarah said as they finished their review, is that setbacks don't mean failure. If you burn dinner or let the kitchen get messy or have days when you can't manage proper meals, that's just part of learning. The goal is progress, not perfection. Friday morning arrived with a sense of both accomplishment and apprehension. Thomas prepared breakfast on his own while Sarah worked on final household organization projects, and the independence felt both empowering and slightly lonely after days of collaborative cooking. But the meal was successful, and more importantly, Thomas felt confident in his ability to repeat and improve on the results. The skills Sarah had taught him were becoming integrated into his daily routine rather than remaining external impositions. Mid-morning brought an unexpected visitor that would test the transformation in Thomas's domestic confidence in ways he hadn't anticipated. Jim Henley, a neighboring rancher and longtime friend of Thomas's father, arrived unexpectedly to discuss some mutual fencing issues and to check on how Thomas was managing after the recent storm. In the past, unexpected visitors had been sources of anxiety for Thomas, forcing him to apologize for the condition of his house or suggest meeting outside to avoid exposing his domestic inadequacy. This time, he found himself inviting Jim inside for coffee without hesitation or embarrassment. "This place looks completely different, Thomas," Jim said as they settled in the transformed living room. "Did you hire a decorator or something?" "I hired household help," Thomas replied, feeling pride rather than shame in the admission. "Sarah Yazzie. She's been helping me get organized and learn to manage things properly." They spent an hour discussing ranch business, but Thomas noticed that the conversation was more relaxed and productive than previous interactions with Jim. Having a welcoming, organized home environment seemed to create a foundation for better relationships, just as Sarah had suggested. When Jim prepared to leave, Thomas found himself making an invitation that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. "You and Mary should come for dinner soon. I've been learning to cook, and I like to practice on friends." Jim's surprise was evident, but so was his pleasure. "That sounds great, Thomas. Mary's been saying we should have you over more often, but she'll be thrilled that you're ready to do some hosting yourself. After Jim left, Thomas realized that a fundamental shift had occurred in his relationship with his own life. The domestic competence Sarah had taught him was transforming not just his daily routines, but his sense of what was possible in terms of relationships and community connections. That afternoon, Sarah made her final major contribution to Thomas's transformation. She taught her what she called maintenance routines, the daily and weekly habits that would preserve and build on everything they had accomplished together. The goal is to integrate these tasks into your natural rhythms so they become automatic rather than burdensome. She explained as they established cleaning schedules, meal planning routines, and organizational maintenance systems. Sarah's approach to maintenance was characteristic of her overall philosophy. Systematic but flexible, designed to support life rather than complicate it. The routines she established were comprehensive enough to maintain order, but efficient enough to fit realistically into Thomas's schedule. Remember, Sarah said as they finished establishing the maintenance framework, these systems are meant to serve you, not control you. If something isn't working, modify it. The goal is sustainable improvement, not rigid adherence to rules. That evening, they shared what Sarah announced would be their last formal dinner together as teacher and student. Thomas had prepared the entire meal himself, demonstrating the skills and confidence he had developed over their week of intensive collaboration. "I can't believe how different my life feels," Thomas said as they ate together. "A week ago, I was barely surviving. Now I feel like I'm actually living." "You were always capable of living well," Sarah replied. "You just needed to learn the skills and develop the systems that would support that capability. The transformation was already inside you." As they finished dinner and completed the cleanup routine that had become second nature, Thomas realized that the week had changed more than just his domestic situation. His entire relationship with himself and his potential had been transformed by learning to take proper care of his basic needs. "Sarah," he said as they put away the last dishes, "I want you to know that what you've done here goes far beyond the job description. You've changed my life in ways I didn't even know were possible." "You changed your own life," Sarah replied. "I just provided guidance and support. The work was yours." That night, as Thomas settled into his comfortable, organized bedroom in his clean, welcoming house, he reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred in just 1 week. He was prepared to maintain his own nutrition, manage his household organization, and create a home environment that could support relationships and personal growth rather than just survival. But more than these practical changes, Sarah had taught him that independence didn't require isolation, that competence could be learned at any age, and that accepting help was a sign of wisdom rather than weakness. The shy rancher who had desperately posted an honest advertisement for household help had become someone capable of managing his own life while maintaining openness to continued learning and growth. The foundation had been laid for a life that balanced solitude with community, competence with humility, and independence with meaningful connections. Thomas Mackenzie's transformation was complete, but his real life was just beginning.